Yes.
Mr. Macniven, could we turn to your, or the Scottish Home and Health Department's relationship with the SNBTS?
Surely.
If we could have green, please, WITN 7064001, page 18. This is, sorry, page 19. This is your witness statement. I won't read the whole of this paragraph out. It's paragraph 32.1, but you say in it that there was a long-standing tension between the SNBTS and the SHHD that predated your involvement with the inquiry. So was that something that you were aware of, predated your involvement with the department? Is that something that you were aware of when you took up your post at the SHHD?
Yes, I remember Sandy Murray, who worked for me on this, briefing me to the same effect as what I've said here.
And how would you describe, we can all read this paragraph and it's available online as well, but in your own words now, how would you describe that tension between the SHHD and the SNBTS?
It was annoying, but not critical to liaison between the two bodies.
Why was it annoying?
Because you had to spend time smoothing it over when there was other things more fruitful to do.
You describe in the paragraph there's a distinction between the macro level, where there was a common shared set of aims between the SHHD and the SNBTS about self-sufficiency and the use of Scottish blood products. But then micro level, as you describe it, there were contentious issues which arose. How frequently did those issues arise?
I would say there would always be one or two bubbling away at any given time.
Was that common in other agencies with whom you dealt?
No.
Why was it, do you think, that the SNBTS did create this tension?
I would say it was largely the personality of John Cash, for whom, as I've said already, I had the highest regard and respect. But I think he would have himself described his approach as being sometimes difficult to work with.
In what way was it difficult to work with?
He had a determination to achieve the most for the BTS, which was in most ways laudable and which was a huge advantage for Scotland. Having an energetic, capable, indefatigable John Cash was an important weapon in our armoury. But he tended to get the wrong end of the stick. He was very impatient of bureaucracy and other forms of obstruction to his endeavours. And he was sometimes hard to persuade that life wasn't just quite how he saw things. And that was energy sapping. Now, I should emphasize that this should not be built up as some form of impediment in liaison between the SNBTS and SHHD. It was not of that order. It was a matter of, as I say, slightly energy sapping work to calm John down, persuade him that things were not quite how he saw it. It was possible to do, but it took a little energy. And at times it was quite hard work separating the issues where John had the wrong end of the stick and issues where he did not, which it was vital that we acted on. And the approach that I took right from the beginning of my time in SHHD, having been briefed, as I say, by Sandy Murray of the existence of this problem, was to communicate as clearly as I could to John Cash where the department was coming from, and to understand as clearly as I could where John was coming from, and thereby distinguish between these two kinds of issues. At one level, it was intellectually stimulating. At another level, there were other ways in which my intellect could have been stimulated.
You were one of the people who liaised with Dr. Cash.
Yes.
Who else from the SHHD would be involved in that relationship?
Principally, John Forrester, Archie McIntyre, Graham Scott, the medical hierarchy, and on the administrative side of things, Sandy Murray, who worked for me, and my boss, and I particularly remember Hugh Morrison because he was my boss for most of the period under review.
To be clear, the issues with Dr. Cash were not about you questioning his expertise or his knowledge or his preeminence in his field. It was the fact that when it came to dealing with bureaucracy, as he saw it, that's where the tension arose.
Yes, and he was commendably energetic to get the best deal for the SNBTS. If one was to be cruel, which I am not, one would describe it as empire building. I didn't see it like that. I saw it as being effectively a chief executive, because effectively chief executive he was, energetic for his client group, viz. The recipients of blood and blood products.
The SHHD, of course, had a wider perspective than just that group and just that organisation, and is that where some of the tension arose from?
You're right, and that there was a tension there, because John, in his role as demandeur, as bidder for resources, was effectively bidding against the rest of the health service. And within a pot of money necessarily finite, SHHD and eventually ministers had to weigh up whether one was better to spend money on the blood transfusion service or whether the needs of patients collectively, the nation of patients, would be better served by putting money into another aspect of the health service. To return to an example that I've used before, were we better investing in the blood transfusion service in whatever, satisfying whatever bid was in front of us at the moment, or to reduce the number of single-manned ambulances which had a clear scope for improving the services to patients and thereby the number of patients who died or were seriously affected by the attendance of an ambulance with only one person, viz. The driver, in it.
Are you able to give a view about how effective Dr. Cash was in that approach that he took to trying to maximise the amount of resources that SNBTS had? Did it work?
Did it work? Were
Yes.
you asking, did it work? Yes, I think it worked well. Under his tutelage, the blood transfusion service grew to meet increasing demand for blood and blood products. And although there were at times difficulties with the quality of its services, it achieved a great deal. For example, effective self-sufficiency in blood and blood products, and retained a quality of service which to its patients that I think Lord Penrose's inquiry found commendable. But if John had been a different person, he could have achieved that excellent, commendable, important outcome with less energy, with less diversion of effort.
You mentioned the phrase empire building and said that you didn't consider it that to be empire building. Did any of your colleagues, to the best of your knowledge, consider that Dr. Cash was empire building?
I can't recollect.
Just one further general point before we look at some documents. There is, I'm sure everybody will recognise, a potential difficulty where there is a fractious relationship, that even with the best of intentions on both sides, there can be a tendency to dismiss the other side as falling back into the same habits of seeking more or arguing with the bureaucrats for the sake of arguing with the bureaucrats. A tendency, as it were, to put up a wall with the antagonist. Is that something that you think happened between some within the HHD and Dr. Cash and the SMBTS generally?
I can't talk about my colleagues in the rest of the my colleagues in SHHD, but there was absolutely no question of a wall inhibiting receipt of John Cash's advice. In my case, and indeed I think I would say also my boss Hugh Morrison's case, to whom I was very close, and I can recollect his attitude. Because we were conscious that this was a very important service where John's stature and ability were hugely helpful. It was just slightly irritating that one had to spend time avoiding a wall being built up. But I stress, there was no wall.
Let's turn to a document which, from the time, which is indicative of some of the tension about which you've spoken. Can we have on screen, please, PRSE 304596, which is a letter written from Dr. Cash to your boss, Hugh Morrison, dated the 21st of August 1986. It was copied to Mr. Donald, who was the chief executive of the CSA. It was not copied, at least formally, to you, but I will read it out and then I'll ask you a few questions about it, including what you knew of it at the time. What Dr. Cash wrote is this: Dear Hugh, I must once again request that consideration be given by appropriate colleagues in SHHD to give Dr. Forrester duties which do not include interface with Scottish Transfusion Service. I cannot begin to understand the problems, but the quality of Dr. Forrester's remarks at the last BTS subcommittee meeting in the context of the Sandoz Collaborative Research Agreement were regarded by my colleagues, particularly Dr. McClellan and myself, as bordering on insulting. They also revealed a depth of scientific / medical understanding that was remarkably and disturbingly shallow. Dr. Forrester made identical comments at the Commercial Interface Steering Group on the 6th of August, and when challenged, made it quite plain that his view of the clinical importance of endotoxic shock / overwhelming coliform septicemia was of historical interest only, and was nowadays quantitatively a trivial matter, had been formed after appropriate consultation, and was, quotes, the official SHHD view on the matter. I made it quite clear to Dr. Forrester on the 6th of August that I, a very large body of scientific and medical workers worldwide, did not share his view or that of the SHHD advisors, and that if this view was indeed the department's official position, then this must be a matter of concern to those of us within the SMBTS who are committing SHS resources into this area. Dr. Forrester did not take the trouble to make contact with me in the period between the 6th of August and the BTS subcommittee to further discuss the matter, and indeed had clearly briefed you, in my opinion wrongly, for our meeting on the 18th of August. This most recent episode has all the hallmarks of the events which took place in late 1985, which led to a 6-month delay in the AIDS validation studies of our plasma-derived blood products, a delay which could have been much longer without the intervention of yourself and the CMA. Taken together, along with other episodes of only minor importance, I must, with regret, conclude that the SMBTS directors have little or no confidence in the person who currently provides the vital medical link between the operational part of the blood transfusion service and SHHD. Go over to the next page, please. I would not wish to claim that all the fault lies with Dr. Forrester. I'm sure he may experience much difficulty in dealing with certain SMBTS medical colleagues and, in particular, myself. This I very much regret, but in our defence, we would wish to emphasise that we have never had this type of difficulty with Dr. Forrester's predecessors. Faced with this apparently intractable problem, I must therefore conclude that the only practical option open for resolution is an accommodation by colleagues in SHHD. I'm copying this letter to Jim Donald as a matter of courtesy because of the resource implications of this scientific development. And that is signed by Dr. Cash. First of all, were you aware of this letter at the time it was sent? Can we take it down now, please, Lawrence?
No, and you can imagine why I wasn't, because it was somebody complaining to my boss about a close colleague.
The concerns expressed by Dr. Cash in the letter include a comment that Dr. Forrester's scientific and medical understanding was shallow. In your experience of Dr. Forrester, do you think that is a fair comment on his abilities?
I'm not really in a position as a non-medic to second-guess the question.
Did you ever get a sense when working with Dr. Forrester that, if I may put it this way, he was not up to the job?
No, I didn't. John, as I've said earlier, was not a very initially accessible person. He kept his thoughts to himself. He expressed himself very briefly. Perhaps he showed his workings too little orally. But he was to a remarkable degree driven by the evidence. He would energetically seek out evidence on the question in front of him and come, a very clever man, come to his own view on its significance, a view which did not necessarily take into account the less evidence-based views of John Cash.
In the example that we've looked at, Baron, we're not going to get into the detail of the rights and wrongs of the medical argument, but underlay it. But it seemed that Dr. Cash was complaining that Dr. Forrester, a generalist and somebody who worked in the SHHD, was presuming to tell the specialists in the SNBTS about what the official HHD line was on a topic that was more within their realm than his. Was that, firstly, something that he should have been doing?
That he, John Forrester, should have been doing?
Yes.
Yeah. It was certainly John's role to communicate to the SNBTS the views of SHHD. I don't remember this issue at all, and it sounds to me like, as you say, an issue where the SNBTS folk would know what way was up better than John Forrester. But I come back to the point that John Forrester was to an amazing degree driven by research and evidence. And there would have been a reason for his statement. It looks to me, though, like this is a relatively trivial issue, because I don't remember it at all, which has been a trigger for a vituperative reaction by John Cash, built on a difficulty of relationship between the two men, which was partly that they were chalk and cheese personally, in their personal characteristics, I mean. A difficulty of relationship between the two Johns, and this apparently small event triggered John Cash to write the letter, a letter where he was commendably frank about the difficulty of dealing with himself. He recognized that he wasn't an easy person to deal with. But I think in looking at this document, you must also look at the reply which the inquiry kindly provided me with, which equally I hadn't seen at the time for the same reason, that Ian MacDonald, the Chief Medical Officer, sent to this letter, which wasn't addressed to him, but really was more his responsibility than Hugh Morrison's. And I think it would be important to look at Ian's response to John Cash to get a more statesmanlike, a more authoritative view of John Cash's concerns. But before you call up that document, which I would advise you to do, it might be worth saying this, that I knew from the beginning, when I took up the post, I knew from Sandy Murray, my subordinate, that there was a difficulty of relationship between John Forrester and John Cash, two men that I got on with very well indeed. And I took it upon myself to act as a conduit with John Cash to a degree that I might not have otherwise done had relationships been better between John Cash and John Forrester. In other words, there was no interruption of the line of communication between the SNBTS in the person of John Cash and SHHD corporately as a result of an unfortunate and, I have to say, unusual lack of good regard between the two Johns.
We will, I can assure you, come to Dr. MacDonald's reply out of fairness to Dr. Forrester. I thought it was always important to put that up on the screen. I will do. There are just a couple of things I'd just like to pick up from what you've just said, though, before we lose that thread. The first was your reference to Dr. Forrester and his evidence-based approach and the way that he would seek out research. does that mean that he independently would throw himself into a topic and do reading around it and come to his own views?
Yes, indeed. He saw it, and I saw it, as important that he should do so. A questioning approach to the advice being given by the SNBTS, in the same way as one took a questioning approach to the advice given by anybody on any of the subjects with which for which I had responsibility. It was a commendable characteristic.
A problem which is often associated with an autodidact is that while there is a, as you say, commendable desire to throw yourself into research, that may also lead to a less commendable willingness to listen to others' views, particularly those who may be more steeped in the subject than you are. Do you think that was a problem that Dr. Forrester had?
He certainly listened to the SNBTS views articulated by John Cash or by others, and he would have listened to them because of his characteristic with great attention. But he would have wanted to make his own mind up about the matter, taking into account not only the assertions of the SNBTS, but also the evidence which he was able to bring to bear.
Just the other point I wanted to pick up on what you've just said is your role in acting as an alternative channel between the SNBTS and the SHHD. Now, allowing for that and allowing both your best efforts and Dr. Cash's best efforts, you weren't medically trained. So there was something that was lost. As Dr. Cash refers to the vital medical link between the SNBTS and the SHHD. Was there something lost as a consequence of you having to do that rather than somebody who was medically trained?
The fact that I'm a mere historian doesn't detract from my ability to understand and weigh the information imparted to me by doctors. So I'm not saying that I knew as much on the subject as John Forrester, never mind John Cash, but I was able to bring intellectual rigor to the question of where the right answer lay. Secondly, John Forrester was not, as our previous conversation has made perfectly clear, the only medical voice in my ear. He worked for the inestimable Archie McIntyre, who was a particularly easy person to get on with and was particularly well practiced in explaining medical information in an accessible way for a layperson like me. Archie worked for the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, Graham Scott, a man of stature, who became a Queen's Honorary Physician later in his career. In other words, he was very well regarded by his medical colleagues. And Graham was, to an unusual degree, involved in the matters of the BTS because he was one of the Secretary of State's appointees to the Management Committee, the board, of the Common Services Agency. So there came across the Management Committee table a great many blood transfusion service issues in which Graham Scott needed to be informed. So John Forrester was not the only medical brain in the department. He was the most junior of a hierarchy of which I've mentioned the two others, but there was also Ian MacDonald, who, although the Chief Medical Officer and therefore a bit detached from the kind of day-to-day problems that I was chewing over with John Cash, had a long background as Deputy Chief Medical Officer, as your document earlier showed, and who had a very long time series of involvement with the blood transfusion service, as the document that you're about to bring up on the screen refers to.
Let's turn to that document now. It's PRSE 302521. And as I say, out of fairness to Dr. Forrester, I'm going to read all of this as I read all of the letter of complaint, as it were. This is sent from Dr. MacDonald, the Chief Medical Officer, to Dr. Cash. Dr. MacDonald wrote this: Dear Dr. Cash, as I am sure you will understand, Mr. Morrison has discussed with me your letter of the 21st of August regarding the replacement of Dr. Forrester for his duties relating to the blood transfusion service. The allocation of doctors' duties in the department is my responsibility, and that is the reason for my replying to you. I have considered your request carefully, and I've consulted colleagues, but I've come to the conclusion that I should not arrange to replace Dr. Forrester at this stage. I do not think that there is sufficient reason for such a change. Dr. Forrester was not involved in any way in the policy considerations which led to the delay in the AIDS validation studies. These matters were decided at DCMO, CMO, and ultimately ministerial level. Dr. Forrester is a knowledgeable and experienced doctor who applies himself with great diligence to his duties, and this is the first complaint about him that has come to my notice. Unfortunately, because of the highly unfavourable conditions of service in the medical civil service, we have lost some very experienced colleagues, including Dr. Bell, and at present we are operating 4 senior medical officers under strength. Nevertheless, Dr. McIntyre, although under extreme pressure at the moment, will monitor the position on BTS liaison, and you should speak to him in the first instance if major or even minor difficulties arise. As you recognise, BTS has never been the simplest organisation to deal with for many, many years, and several of us have the scars to prove it. And that's signed by Dr. MacDonald. The reference to operating at 4 senior medical officers under strength, were you aware of that undermanning at the time?
No, I wasn't, until I saw this letter many years after the event. I had never any difficulty that I can recall getting medical advice on any of the subjects for which I had responsibility, which spanned the responsibilities of quite a number of senior medical officers in the department. As I think I've said earlier, in the gap between John Forrester's retirement and Ros, what was Ros's last name, his successor, who was called Ros, arrival, I would have turned to Archie McIntyre for any advice that I needed. I certainly would not have been inhibited from seeking that advice. So the answer is no. Poor Ian MacDonald obviously felt the absence of his 4 senior medical officers more keenly than I did.
Dr. Ros Skinner is the name
of course, Ros Skinner, yes.
Thank you. Do you have any other comments on the letter that we have just seen?
Yes, 2 or 3. In the first paragraph, you emphasised my, with an implication that John Cash should have written to Ian rather than to Hugh Morrison. Ian was a gentle soul, and there would have been no, in his mind, there would have been no rancour in the fact, or I don't imagine that Ian bore John Cash any grudge from having misdirected the letter. As misdirected, he had done it. He shouldn't have written to Hugh Morrison. He should have written to Ian MacDonald. Secondly, in paragraph 3, there's a reference by Ian MacDonald to the same sort of compliments about John Forrester as I gave. Thirdly, it's interesting that Ian MacDonald set up a liaison between John Cash and Archie McIntyre as a way of bypassing the personal difficulties that the two Johns suffered from. I wasn't actually aware of Archie. I, who was ignorant of this letter at the time, wasn't aware of John Cash suddenly dealing with Archie McIntyre. I suspect that the letter of 21st August was John Cash breaking into print on a matter where other folk might have said, that's a pity, could have been better done, but we need to get on with the job. In other words, John Cash overreacting to a difficulty, a real difficulty, but not a major difficulty that he had in relationship with John Forrester. We've all got people in our lives that are difficult to deal with. You get on and blowing well, deal with them, not moan about it.
I'd like to turn to a specific issue now, which is surrogate testing. It touches upon this relationship between the SNBTS and the SHHD. And just so that everybody is aware of the terminology that's being applied, surrogate testing was, in this context, testing for hepatitis B core antibody or for raised ALT levels in blood donations as a proxy for non-A, non-B hepatitis, because in the period that we're dealing with, 1986 to 1988, there was no specific test for hepatitis C as it later became known. So that is the issue.
The way you put that, is that those two tests as alternatives or in combination?
At different points in the papers, there is discussion of applying one or the other or both.
So we have to be mindful of the context.
It depends on the context, yes.
Thank you.
The important point is that neither of the two tests certainly identified whether the donor had non-A, non-B hepatitis. And that was because at the time, non-A, non-B hepatitis had not been identified as a separate disease, if you like. So it wasn't possible to devise a direct test, and these were for its presence, and these were two second best ways of doing, which were, as Matthew Hill says, alternatives, as I understand it as a non-doctor.
Ultimately, the question of whether or not to introduce surrogate testing in Scotland was a matter that fell within the remit of the Scottish Home and Health Department and the responsible minister. Is that right?
Absolutely.
It wasn't for the Department of Health to tell you what to do. The SHHD could form its own policy, but would do so, no doubt, with consultation with the Department of Health.
Correct.
Within the different hierarchies, both the HHHD and externally, I'd just like to look at the different roles that the different organisations and the different people within those organisations will play. So firstly, what would be the role of the SNBTS and Dr. Cash on the question of surrogate testing?
They, principally John Cash, but also colleagues like Brian McClelland, would be very, very, very concerned to identify causes of possible infection from blood and blood products and any way of protecting the patient group against these problems. Now that's their general responsibility, so I saw them at work trying to bottom out this difficult question of what non-A, non-B hepatitis was, which turned out to be a kind of basket of different viral infections, as I understand it, and how one could protect the quality of blood and blood products against that infection. So they would have been very, very energetically involved in keeping in touch with the international research evidence on the matter.
Is it fair to say that they would have more expertise on the question of infections through blood products than even the medical staff in the HHD?
Oh yes, hugely, a different order of magnitude.
What then was the role of the medical civil servants in the SHHD in this policy?
In the same way as was true in generality, that they were responsible for medical advice to ministers on the matter.
Did they play, in some way, a role in translating the scientific advice that they may have been getting from SNBTS into advice that was understandable to the layperson, be it the civil servant or the minister?
Yes, although remember I also had direct contact with the BTS on the matter.
And what was your role, the role of the administrative civil servants?
To consider whether one should spend a very large amount of money, £800,000 comes to mind, which in those days was more valuable than it is today, whether that was best spent on this matter than on the other ways in which patients could benefit from health service spending. And that involved taking a critical view of the evidence for the effectiveness of these two forms of surrogate testing that you've alluded to a moment ago.
What about the CMO, the DCMO? What were their roles?
No different from the medical hierarchy that I mentioned a moment ago. They were part of that medical hierarchy.
And finally, the ministers, what was their role?
Minister's role would have been to take a decision on whether the game was worth the candle, whether surrogate testing, for all its inadequacies and unfortunate side effects, was worth spending that sum of money on. But I stress that that's a theoretical point, because so far as I'm aware, the matter was never put to ministers.
I'm not aware of any evidence that it was put to ministers either. We'll come on to that in due course. Finally, externally, I alluded to it earlier, the Department of Health, would they have had any say, or what would have been their influence or their role, at least as a consultee in this matter?
Yes, their resources were greater. The resources of the department were greater, and they had access, obviously, to the advice from the people in the blood transfusion service in England. We would certainly have discussed with them whether to introduce surrogate testing. As I explained in the first half of the morning, they had no power of direction over us. We could theoretically have taken a different decision on either side of the border, but we would certainly have had repeated discussions both at administrative level and more frequently, more importantly, at medical, the professional medical contacts between the two departments would have been very important. There was something I wanted to add on that. They didn't have power of direction. Although theoretically we could have taken a different decision on either side of the border, in practice, this is an area where, as I alluded to this morning, we would have had to be very careful not to embarrass cabinet colleagues. We were part of the same government, and we would have made sure that we took the same attitude on this important matter, or we would have agreed that the evidence about, for example, the incidence of non-A, non-B hepatitis in the two countries was such that a different decision on surrogate testing was justified.
If you had, in theory, taken a different decision in Scotland, would you have required specific Treasury approval for the spending of however many hundreds of thousands of pounds it turned out to be to introduce it?
Your question is a theoretical one.
Yes.
But no, Treasury approval would not, I think, have been necessary. The way that the funding arrangements worked was that the Scottish office had a budget which it could spend, was allocated a budget by Treasury, which it could spend more or less as it thought fit in the interests of, in this case, the patients of the NHS in Scotland. So although there were some cases where one had to seek specific Treasury approval for expenditure, I can't see that this would be one of them.
There would have been, for example, no need to flag it in any PES bid saying,
I can't see that there would have been any such reason. The sums that we were talking about for the Scottish budget as a whole would have been enormously much greater. So I think that's right. We wouldn't have had to refer to it in explaining a PES bid to Treasury. I should explain that I say that with a certain amount of tentativeness, because I wasn't in the finance function in the Scottish government, and so I'm saying would probably have been rather than would definitely have been.
That is understood. As you stressed earlier, this is a theoretical discussion, because as you say at paragraph 54.1 of your statement, and I won't ask to bring it up, you said that your recollection is that the consistent and unanimous conclusion of the SHHD throughout the period to which the documents that we're going to look at relate was that there was insufficient scientific or medical grounds for its introduction. Firstly, is that an accurate summary of your evidence?
Well, that's why I put it in the written statement.
Yes, quite. And secondly, is that a view that was reached within the SHHD by members of the SHHD without being lent on, as it were, or pressured by the DHSS?
Absolutely. There was no question of pressure. Indeed, you've let me see one document where one of my medical colleagues was saying, hey, look, the medics in Department of Health are very worried that we'll go ahead with surrogate testing and they'll be embarrassed. So no, they weren't in a position to direct us what to do. It was a question of discussion between the two departments. But I should stress this. We had come to the view, the unanimous view, the repeated unanimous view on surrogate testing, which you mentioned a moment ago, was in my written statement. We would have got a certain amount of comfort from the fact that the Department of Health, with its greater resources, and the blood transfusion service in England was of the same mind, that surrogate testing should not be introduced, despite the possible advantages that would give.
Was it then a case of having your view reinforced rather than it being shaped?
That is my recollection, yes. I say that slightly tentatively because I don't really remember 35 years later.
Let's then look at some of the documents. And what I'm going to do is introduce some elements of the chronology by reference to Chapter 27 of the Penrose Final Report, which is something that you mention in your witness statement. We won't go through the detail of those documents, just to give us a structure. It begins or at least the point at which I'm going to pick up the story, begins in February 1986. It's at paragraph 27.66 of Chapter 27 of Penrose, with the Blood Bank Weekly, the official publication of the American Association of Blood Banks, reporting that the Blood Products Advisory Committee of the FDA would recommend both ALT and anti-HBC testing later that year. And indeed, we can see from the Penrose report that such testing was introduced in the United States in 1986 and 1987, and that it had been in place in West Germany and in Italy for several years before, but in many other European countries, there was no surrogate testing. In May 1986, so at around the time that you were joining the SHHD, the SNBTS included the figure that you gave earlier, £810,000, in their bid for funding, specifically to commence surrogate testing in 1987 to 1988. So this was the SNBTS saying, we would like this money to introduce surrogate testing. Now, were you aware of that bid at the time it was made? And do you recall how significant an issue it was within the SHHD on your arrival at the department?
I certainly would have been aware of that bid as soon as it was submitted because of its size and difficulty. That was some months after I joined the SHHD. I don't recall at the moment of my joining the SHHD that it was a live question. I think it would have been brought to our notice first by that public expenditure survey bid, or by conversations with the SNBTS around the time that they were bidding.
But it was clearly the view of the SNBTS at that time that they would like that money for that particular
Correct.
allocation.
Correct.
And if we could have, please, on screen now, PRSE 40857. And I just pause before we bring this up to note that there is a distinction that we must keep in mind throughout this between the official position of the SNBTS and the directors of the SNBTS and individual scientists and doctors who work for organisations either directly for SNBTS or connected with SNBTS, who at points we can see take a different view to the official SNBTS line. Now, this document that we have on screen is a minute from Dr. Forrester dated the 12th of June 1986. And I'm going to read through not all of it, but parts of it. It is entitled Transmission of Non-A, Non-B Hepatitis by Blood and Blood Products. Is it practicable to reduce or prevent it by introducing ALT testing of donations? Paragraph 1, it says this. The information in this note is mostly derived from the PhD thesis entitled Non-A, Non-B Hepatitis in West Scotland, compiled in 1985 by Dr. B.C. Dow under the supervision of Dr. Follett and others. 2. Hepatitis can be transmitted by blood and blood products and is in Scotland an occasional but serious consequences of blood transfusion. Goes on then to discuss various other matters. This is about hepatitis A and hepatitis B as well. Point 3, non-A, non-B hepatitis is not a specific disease, but a heterogeneous collection of diseases. The hepatitis conditions due to the Epstein-Barr virus and cytomegalovirus are a substantial part of it, but there is general belief that some, as yet unidentified virus infection is also part of it. Thus, there can be no accepted test capable of detecting the virus in blood. Detection is by exclusion of other conditions, such as those mentioned. Non-A, non-B hepatitis, thus defined, is not uncommon in the population. Dr. Dan Reed reckons an incidence for Scotland of 154 cases per year, but has little confidence in his estimate because it can only be derived by starting from the total of all hepatitis cases reported, probably underreported, by clinicians, and deducting the cases of hepatitis B detected in laboratories, probably fully reported. It is common among drug abusers. But in association with blood transfusion, it is very uncommon in the west of Scotland. Over the last 8 years, 1 to 5 cases are found each year there, and there is no upward trend. There are peculiar difficulties in identifying its presence in haemophiliacs, since their blood exhibits diverse reactions because of repeated administration of blood products. But Dr. Dow found no evidence of any substantial problem. Dr. Dow reckons that the proportion of donations infected with non-A, non-B hepatitis may be 18 per 100,000. The condition is not, as a rule, serious, and most of the cases detected have not even been jaundiced. There may, however, be a tendency for it to become chronic. The long-term outlook is inevitably not yet known. The case fatality rate is estimated in a textbook consulted by Dr. Dan Reed at less than 0.1%, except in pregnant women, who are at much greater risk, 10% if they contracted during the last 3 months of pregnancy. It then goes on to talk about the use of ALT tests, and it emphasises that the drawbacks are that some infective donations might still be missed, false negatives, and some harmless donations might be excluded, false positives. The American evidence is that both drawbacks are serious. Only perhaps 38% of the genuinely infected donations are detected, and some 70% of the apparently infected donations are harmless. Rejection of donations might reach 3%, a grave loss. Going over the page, refers to the situation in New York. The cost was put at $2 per donation. Dr. Dow concluded that in Scotland, quotes, cost would be extremely high and benefit minimal, especially when only a few cases of non-A, non-B post-transfusion hepatitis are reported each year. Then at point 8, Dr. Dan Reed and Dr. Follett do not recommend the introduction of ALT testing of Scottish blood donations for the above reasons. Firstly, on this minute, do you recall if you saw it at the time? I'm afraid there is no distribution list attached to it.
I don't recall.
Paragraph 1, it states that the information in it is mostly derived from Dr. Dow's thesis. This was a thesis that was criticised by Lord Penrose for some of its methodology. I'll just bring up that criticism. PRSE 305070. And if we could have page, so we can see this is chapter 27 of Lord Penrose's report. And if we could have page 32, please. We can see there at 27.115, there is a summary of some of the findings of the report from Dr. Pollard and Dr. Dow. And it says this in the second sentence. Recipients of the donations were not followed up and no data were gathered on the use of the 10,655 donations or their destination within the blood services. Data were available of clinically likely cases of post-transfusion NA and B hepatitis reported to Glasgow and West of Scotland BTS. There have been reports of 9 cases only. The notification requirements related to infective jaundice. They were not well adapted to generate reports of non-A, non-B hepatitis, which was in fact seldom associated with clinical jaundice. In addition, reports of notifications of an infectious disease whose characteristics were poorly understood by clinicians generally were most unlikely to provide sound evidence of the prevalence of the condition. Without follow-up of the donations tested, the study did not provide a basis on which the prevalence of post-transfusion NA and B hepatitis could or should have been drawn. Unfortunately, it was concluded on the basis of the reported cases that post-transfusion NA and B hepatitis was, quote, not a major problem in the region. That conclusion was not based on sound evidence, nor did it indicate the potential value of ALT surrogate testing or a basis for assessing that value. Even more unfortunately, as will be seen below, the conclusions from the report were for several years used to support the contention that post-transfusion NA and B hepatitis was not a significant problem. That is Lord Penrose's conclusion or critique of Dr. Dow's thesis. Do you have any comment on Lord Penrose's critique?
No, it's based on a thorough post facto investigation of all the evidence on the subject, including the post facto observations of expert witnesses. So I would take it as absolutely authoritative.
Were you aware at the time that there were these potential flaws in Dr. Dow's methodology and Dr. Dow's study?
No.
Now, it's correct, isn't it, that you stress in your witness statement that Dr. Dow's thesis was not the only source of information that the SHHD had about the severity of non-A, non-B, the wider issue of surrogate testing. But at this stage, would you agree that this note is expressly said to be mostly derived from Dr. Dow's thesis?
The note that you threw up a moment ago by John Forrester, yes, correct. It's explicitly a summary of that PhD thesis.
And through the months that followed, Dr. Dow's PhD thesis continued, did it not, to be a significant source of information for the agency?
That's what Lord Penrose's inquiry concluded, yes. But not but as I've said, not the only bit of information, but part of the information base that we will have relied upon.
Now, I'm conscious that you are, and as you put it, mere historian, not a scientist. but a question that may be raised and may be submitted to the chair in due course is that a reason why the SHHD and Dr. Forrester and others placed emphasis on this paper was because it supported their position, in effect, confirmation bias. Do you think that that would be a fair critique of Dr. Forrester?
I think that that's putting the cart before the horse. It is part of the information on which our view was based. But I cannot imagine that it carried much weight with Department of Health colleagues south of the border who came to the same conclusion as we did.
There was there not a dearth of research in Scotland on NAMB?
Yes, and that we saw as unfortunate. It was clear that there was some difference internationally and conceivably within the UK in the incidence of blood-borne non-A, non-B hepatitis, but we didn't have enough information on the scale of the Scottish problem. So yes, we were supportive of research on the matter, which I think Department of Health were also supportive of, and research was indeed launched south of the border, to our regret, without Scottish participation.
Dr. McClellan, we know from reading Penrose, had pushed for research from the early 1980s. Perhaps an obvious point, but it would have been helpful to you to had those research proposals been taken forward.
Absolutely, yes. Wise after the event, but yes, it would have been.
And of course, you weren't involved in any way. In fact, you wouldn't.
I wasn't involved in any way.
You weren't involved in any way in deciding on whether or not those research proposals went forward, because that predated your time at the SHH.
Yes, indeed.
Just for completeness, Dr. Dan Reid, who was mentioned there, he was the director of the Communicable Diseases Surveillance Centre at Rutch Hill Hospital in Glasgow.
Yes, so not part of the blood transfusion service, but a very relevant expert.
Turning now to a little later, 16th of October 1986, I won't ask that this document be brought up. The reference is PRSE 304812. Dr. Scott, the DCMO, sent a minute to Dr. Forrester and Mr. Murray asking about non-A, non-B hepatitis screening and saying that he would like to know where this stands. It says CMO DHSS is worried that if we go ahead, England and Wales will have to follow suit. I think there must be consultation with DHSS before we agree to provide funds for this screening.
That is the document that I was recollecting a moment ago, where the English department medics were expressing their concern that we might go ahead, to their embarrassment.
Dr. Scott is referring to consultation, not seeking instructions from the Department of Health.
Correct. That's absolutely the right verb to use.
If we then look at the response to that, and I will ask that this is brought up, PRSE 304313. This is from Sandy Murray, the SEO, Senior Executive Officer, to Dr. Scott. And he writes this: I refer to your minute of the 16th of October and can confirm that the bid we are making to our finance colleagues for money for the SNBTS in 1987 to 88 makes no provision for non-A and non-B hepatitis screening. And then he gives some figures that I needn't trouble you with. The exchange there suggests that Dr. Scott is being informed about the decision on the bid, not that he is deciding the decision, but that decision has already been taken. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, it is.
In his written evidence for Lord Penrose, Mr. Murray, who we remember was in the fifth tier of the civil service hierarchy, so we can take that down now. Thank you very much, Lawrence. Mr. Murray said in his written evidence to Lord Penrose that he was the one who, in effect, took that decision, although he would have consulted with more senior colleagues as well. So the SNBTS, with their expertise, have suggested that they want money for surrogate testing. And that bid has not proceeded beyond Mr. Murray and his colleagues. Now, first of all, would you have been one of those colleagues?
Absolutely.
The Deputy Chief Medical Officer is being informed about that decision, and it having already been taken. My question to you is, why is it that the civil servants and the medical officers at around tier 4 or tier 5 were the ones taking that decision, rather than either more senior civil servants or ultimately the minister?
Because we regarded it, I must say I was slightly surprised to see that Graham Scott had not been involved in the decision taking, particularly because he was a member of the Common Services Agency Management Committee, which was a party to the PES bid, and it may be that he was asking for his mind to be refreshed on the matter. However, the implication, as you say, was that he had not been involved in the decision taking, which I deduce must have meant that his subordinates, Archie McIntyre and John Forrester, regarded it as insufficiently uncertain to escalate to their boss. But these two will certainly have been involved in the decision taking, as was I, and almost certainly Hugh Morrison, my boss.
When you say insufficiently uncertain, does that mean that the view amongst those within the SHHD was sufficiently certain that this should be refused?
Correct.
They didn't need to involve anybody higher up?
Correct. At that stage, the bid, obviously, Sandy Murray transmitting that bid to the Finance Division was not the end of the story. There was also an iterative process with Finance Division, but it's a little unlikely that iterative process would have included any consideration of the introduction of surrogate testing, because it had been eliminated as a bid at an earlier stage.
You said earlier that the minister's role in all of this would be to decide whether the game was worth the candle, whether the cost of the surrogate testing was worth the benefits to the patients that were said to derive from it. The minister can't take a decision on that unless he is informed of it.
That's correct, and that is true of a multitude of other decisions taken across the Scottish Office. As we've covered already, there was a limit to the number of decisions which ministers could take in person rather than through the medium of the civil service. So that was an entirely, as I said at the time, theoretical question, because it was never, to my knowledge, put to ministers.
Indeed, there is no evidence that it was put to evidence, at least that I have seen or that Lord Penrose found. looking back now, do you think that as of 1986, it should have been put to ministers?
I have no appetite for making retrospective decisions of that kind. It's absolutely clear that in 1986 we did not think that it was worth putting to ministers, and it's clear why we didn't think that it was worth putting to ministers.
And the reason why was because the view within the SHHD was that it was not worth the candle.
Correct. And it was the view also of the Department of Health, I observe.
So I note the time. We're going to take the story forward through 1987 and into 1988, but perhaps after a sandwich.
Yes, well, we'll take a break now until 2 o'clock. So 2 o'clock.